Historians call it the Great Famine, but few truly know what it meant to live through it. When harvests failed and bread vanished, ordinary people turned to the forests, the rivers, and even the bark of trees to survive. What they ate wasn't just strange, it changed Europe forever. When you imagine medieval Europe, you might picture banquets in great halls, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, overflowing goblets, and platters of bread. But for most people, that vision was a dream belonging to another world. The real story of food in the Middle Ages was quieter, humbler, and often hungrier. And when the grain failed, when the harvest died under the relentless rain or the ground froze too soon, that quiet world turned into one of survival, invention, and endurance. It begins with the weather. In the early 1300s, Europe slipped into what historians later called the Little Ice Age. The summers grew colder and wetter, the winters longer. The skies that once brought gentle spring rains instead delivered endless gray storms. In the year 1315, the rain started, and they didn't stop. In the English countryside, fields that should have been golden with wheat and barley were drowned under standing water. Oxen, too weak from hunger, sank into the mud. The smell of rot and mildew filled the air. Wet hay, spoiled grain, mold spreading across storage barns. Harvest carts that should have carried abundance creaked empty down the lanes. To the people who lived then, it must have felt like the world itself had turned against them. Grain was not just food. It was everything. Bread formed the base of nearly every meal. Peasants ate it with a bit of cheese or dipped it in broth if they were lucky. Soldiers carried hard biscuits baked so dry they could last for months. Even beer, safer to drink than much of the water, depended on grain. Without it, daily life lost its rhythm. In small villages across Europe, people waited for the weather to turn. They hoped the next week would bring sun, that the soggy fields might dry. But by the time the autumn of 1315 arrived, it was clear. The harvest was gone. Grain stores, which had already been low from the previous poor season, emptied faster than anyone expected. The wealthy still ate. They had reserves or land in drier regions. But for the ordinary villagers, farmers, craftsmen, herders, the crisis began slowly and then all at once. At first, the loaves grew smaller. Bakers mixed their flour with whatever could stretch it: bean powder, peas, even sawdust. The bread grew coarser, darker, harder to chew. Then came the bitter substitutes: tree bark ground into powder, or acorns crushed into meal. It filled the belly, but not for long soon. Even that was hard to find. By midwinter, the real famine had begun. A chronicle from the time tells us that the poor ate dogs, horses, and even the dead. Whether every account is true or not, there is no question that people were desperate. Chroniclers, often monks, described scenes of villages stripped bare of life. No chickens clucking in the yard, no cows in the byre, not even mice in the granary. Everything that could be eaten was, but famine didn't arrive everywhere in the same way. In some villages, the people adapted in quieter, more ingenious ways. They began to look to the landscape, not for what was once planted, but for what grew on its own. Wild greens became valuable. Plants like sorrel, nettle, goosefoot, and fat hen, once dismissed as weeds, were now gathered with care. Women walked the fields with baskets and knives, collecting what they could before others got to it. Nettles, boiled into soup, lost their sting and offered iron and minerals. Sorrel added a sourness that reminded people faintly of vinegar, a taste of something fresh in a season of rot. Villagers also turned to the forests. They gathered acorns and beech nuts, boiling them over and over to leach out the bitterness before grinding them into flour. They hunted small animals, rabbits, pigeons, and sometimes cats, anything that could move. In coastal areas, they scoured tidal flats for mussels and limpets. Inland, they dug for roots and tubers, unearthing things that had never before been considered food. And then there was pottage. If you had almost nothing, you still had pottage. It was the simplest and most common food of the Middle Ages, a stew of whatever ingredients were available. In good years, it might include peas, grains, and bits of meat. In famine years, it might be little more than water, nettles, and salt. Villagers kept the pot simmering day after day, adding scraps whenever they could. It was never full, never empty, a quiet reflection of endurance itself. In places where famine bit hardest, people learned old lessons that had nearly been forgotten. Bark bread, for instance, was not an invention of the 14th century. It had appeared in Scandinavia during earlier shortages. In Norway and Sweden, people stripped birch and pine trees of their inner bark, a thin, fibrous layer that could be dried, ground, and mixed with flour. It wasn't tasty, but it kept people alive. Word of such techniques spread slowly south, sometimes carried by monks, sometimes by traveling traders, but as the months passed, even these substitutes began to fail. The livestock died. Fields lay unplowed. Seed grain, once carefully stored for spring planting, was eaten out of necessity. Each desperate meal was also a small theft from the future. By the second year, the famine deepened. The chronicles describe that the price of bread in London had risen fourfold. In France, the king ordered grain shipments to be guarded by soldiers to prevent riots. In the countryside, peasants walked for miles in search of food, carrying children too weak to walk. Some made their way to monasteries, where they were given thin porridge or barley water. Charity stretched thin over endless hunger. The monasteries themselves were not immune. Though they had gardens, fish ponds, and stored grain, their resources dwindled too. Some abbots faced impossible choices: feed the villagers and risk their own monks' survival, or close the gates. Many chose compassion. Others simply had no more to give, a monk in Flanders recorded. We fed them from our stores until there was nothing left but seed corn. And still they came. Still they came, for those who survived. The famine changed how they thought about food forever. It also changed what they grew, how they stored it, and how they cooked it. The crisis taught people that survival depended not only on harvests, but on ingenuity. When the rains finally ceased, and the fields began to dry, villages began the slow process of rebuilding. But even as green shoots appeared again, hunger lingered. People were thinner, weaker. Diseases that rarely spread in better years, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox, now ran through weakened populations, and yet life went on. The world did not end. From the ashes of the Great Famine came a kind of grim wisdom, a new understanding of what could sustain life when abundance vanished. Recipes that had once been shameful became tradition. Bark bread and acorn flour were remembered not as desperation, but as cleverness. Wild greens were cultivated in gardens. Pottage became the foundation of European peasant cuisine for centuries. Still, the scars remained. Even a decade later, people spoke of those years in hushed tones. Children who had survived grew up to teach their own children how to recognize edible plants. Village priests told stories of the rains in their sermons, as warnings against waste and pride. And across Europe, new rituals of gratitude emerged: harvest feasts, seed blessings, prayers for good weather, not grand affairs, but small, humble acts of remembrance. But the hunger returned, again and again. The 14th century would bring more than famine. There would be war, plague, and more bad harvests. Yet in a strange way, those who lived through the Great Famine were better prepared for what came after. They knew what could be eaten, what could be made, and what could be endured. They knew that a loaf could be stretched farther than anyone thought possible. To imagine their lives now is to enter a world of small details: the sound of rain hitting thatch, the feel of rough acorn dough under tired hands, the steam rising from a pot of nettle soup on a smoky hearth. It was not a world of comfort, but of quiet persistence. The famine also revealed something about the structure of medieval society. In times of plenty, the hierarchy seemed unshakable: lords, clergy, peasants. But hunger blurred those lines. When the granaries emptied, the difference between noble and commoner mattered less than who still had a sack of barley. In some cases, the powerful opened their stores. In others, they hoarded them. The memory of such actions lingered. In many villages, this period planted the earliest seeds of rebellion, not violent revolution, but a deep sense of injustice that would echo in centuries to come. What's remarkable is not how people starved, but how they survived. In Germany, records describe families surviving on famine gruel, a mixture of boiled weeds, wild oats, and a little salt. In Ireland, people ate the roots of rushes and wild onions. In parts of France, chestnuts became the savior crop, ground into meal that could make a passable bread. In Scandinavia, people mixed fish bones, moss, and bark to create sustenance. When nothing else remained, and everywhere, there was a kind of quiet creativity, a willingness to turn whatever existed into something edible. Hunger, terrible as it was, forced innovation. It was not the kind of innovation celebrated in royal courts or remembered in chronicles, but it shaped the everyday lives of millions. Techniques of food preservation, drying, smoking, fermenting, became essential knowledge. Villagers learned how to store turnips in pits through the winter, how to dry peas for spring planting, how to stretch a single cow through a season by making cheese from its milk. Even the idea of what food was began to shift. The famine blurred the boundary between sustenance and survival. People no longer thought only of what tasted good, but of what could endure, what could be stored, carried, shared, and remade. When the famine finally ended, Europe did not immediately return to abundance. It took years for soil fertility to recover, for seed stocks to be replenished. Many villages were abandoned entirely. Others rebuilt slowly, stone by stone. But the story of what people ate, or rather, what they learned to eat, lived on in the centuries that followed. Echoes of the Great Famine remained in European cuisine. The reliance on root vegetables, the respect for soup and stew, the careful use of every part of an animal, all trace their lineage to those desperate years. Even the concept of communal meals, where a village would share a single large pot of food, endured long after hunger had passed. The famine also left behind lessons in humility. Chroniclers of the time often wrote that the famine was a divine punishment, that God had sent rain to remind humanity of its dependence. But beneath that theology lies a simpler truth. The earth is not guaranteed to feed us, and survival depends on both respect and resilience. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the quiet clatter of a medieval kitchen, a wooden spoon stirring a thin broth, the hiss of water over fire, the soft murmur of people eating together after days of hunger. They did not feast, but they lived, and that in itself was a kind of triumph. The next time you see a loaf of bread, consider what it meant to them. In that small, ordinary thing was history, centuries of struggle, ingenuity, and quiet persistence, because when the grain ran out, what people discovered was not just how to feed themselves, but how to endure. And perhaps that's the most human story of all. The way, even in the darkest years, people found a way to keep the fire burning, to share what little they had, and to wait patiently for the fields to bloom again. And that's where we'll leave this story tonight. A quiet glimpse into a world where people found ways to endure, even when the world itself seemed to have run out of food. If you enjoyed drifting through this slow piece of history, I'd be grateful if you took a moment to like this video. It helps more sleepy historians find their way here. And if you'd like more calm, quietly told stories like this one, consider subscribing to Quiet Boring Sleep every week. We wander through forgotten corners of history, not for the drama, but for the peace that comes from hearing how ordinary people lived, worked, and survived. Until next time, rest well, sleep deeply, and dream of gentler centuries gone by.